Well, it's so good to see you guys here today. Thank you so much for being here. And excited to get to celebrate a little bit afterwards with some fellowship on the patio. And, it's Halloween, which is kind of an awkward day to have like church on Sunday on Halloween. Do you feel this little like Halloween is, for those of you how many of you love to dress up? See, right, yeah, and then there's the introverts that are like, oh, it's like so much pressure, right? But no, Halloween is super fun, and but also has got this sort of dark texture to it, doesn't it? Like The Office, every season would have like a Halloween episode, and I just remember this one with Creed. He's like my favorite character in The Office, where he comes in, he's got blood all over his shirt, and there's a new employee that's like, oh, I didn't realize everybody dressed up for Halloween, and he's like, oh yeah, it's Halloween. Like, what really, really good timing. Right? But, it's Halloween today. Tomorrow is what's called All Saints' Day. And All Saints' Day is a time of remembrance. It's a time of remembering the people in our lives who have gone before us that have left a mark on our lives, people whose story has left an impression on our hearts. And there's a writer that I like. She writes for the New York Times right now. Her name's Tish Harrison Warren. And I was reading this morning. She says, saints are imperfect people. And this is what draws me to this day. Christians don't remember these men and women because they were perfect. We remember them because, like us, they were broken and selfish and fearful. Yet God wrought beauty and light from their lives. I love that idea of these sort of broken saints through which God shines his light. And really our message today as we're going to 1 John is as simple as that. John is going to start with this really basic, simple truth that God is light. And for us, an exhortation that we would then walk in that light. As simple as that, and yet such complexity and depth. I think we spend a lifetime seeking to understand just what that means. John is going to make it clear that this understanding of God is where we begin. He's going to say God is light and in him is no darkness. That if we get that wrong, right, then it sort of affects everything from there on. That God is light. In fact, John, that idea of God being light is used over 100 times in the New Testament, and I think over 40 are used by John. It was kind of his symbol for who God was, what he came to do. And this idea of light, to me, it's a beautiful symbol because in one sense, it's so simple, right? Even a little child knows the power of light. As they're going to sleep at night, in that time of darkness, they ask that light would be left on, right? Or their door left open a crack. Something about light brings not just illumination, but with it comfort, a sense of security. And yet light, too, continues to be one of the most complex things out there. I love how physicists still can't get their heads around it. That light in its very nature is a paradox. Are you familiar with this idea? I have this story that I've told before, but I was reading a book on quantum mechanics, and it was talking about, these sort of competing ideas that light has been discovered as a particle, as a photon, this like quanta of energy, that light is like these bullets that are shot, and yet the pattern of it, this wave, this energy wave, is in its essence as well, and that these two things, you kind of can't have one or the other, and yet light holds on to both. And you go, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, fine, whatever. But the truth is, like, with some experiments, it demonstrates some really kind of odd, to say the least, behavior in light, where light, if it's shot as a single photon through a slit, will go straight through like a bullet, but when you open up a possibility for it, it behaves as if it's aware of what the guy behind him is going to do, right? That each one of those individual particles has a sense of awareness of the choice in front of it, and then is making a sort of decision. And I was telling a friend about this at lunch, saying that light has a consciousness to it. And he's looking at me like, you're insane. And then this guy walks up to us and says, are you guys here with the conference? And I said, no. And he said, but you're physicists. I was like, well. And I said, no, I'm a pastor. And he's like, but you're talking about cognitive particle augmentation. I was like, well, yeah, you know. And my friend is looking at me like, what in the world, right? This idea, this guy was like at this conference hosted by the Department of Defense studying this idea of light and this sense of awareness that it has. And when we look out at the world, we think we understand and know these things, and yet so often, even the light itself takes us to the brink of our knowing, and we're sort of staring into the unknown. And I love this. It's been said that every theoretical physicist eventually starts, whether they know it or not, doing theology. That we're stepping into a bigger picture of reality. And this is what John is reminding us of, that not just is God this sort of light that penetrates, but this greater reality, this greater mystery. Our passage today is just 3 verses. I want to read them for us here in 1 John 1, 5 through 7. He says, this is the message which we have heard from him, from Christ, and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. Now again, this sort of simple little picture that John is drawing for us here, this is what it means to follow Christ as a manner of walking in the light, following him in the light. And these 2 things will take place: a purifying of our hearts and a greater fellowship with one another. It's this kind of simple little math that he's doing for us here, and I like this. God is light, in him is no darkness. Therefore, if there's darkness in your life, this is where you're out of step, right? You found yourself breaking fellowship with God, which is what sin is. When we choose to step out of the light, when we choose to break fellowship, when we choose to go our own way. And this idea of walking in the light, that simple little point, but we realize that life is this unfolding journey ahead of us. What we would like is to be able to sort of remain in the light, and yet what we find is that the light is moving. It's traveling as we travel through light, so is the light. And so we walk in it. We have to almost keep up with it, match its step. And we know this about life, that it's constantly changing. I was thinking I got bombarded with all these pictures of my little kids this morning on Facebook that, all the little costumes throughout the years, and now Patty and our kids are going to be like, see ya, right? They're off to get candy, and we're just going to sit there and pass it out. And this stage, right, we look back on those sweet times. If you've got little kids, such sweet moments of life. But there's a season, and then there's another season, and another season, which is why I think we are always sort of feeling like we're winging it in life, don't we? That just when you think you've got it figured out, it's like next chapter, and then next chapter, and next chapter. And as much as we would like to freeze time, it doesn't. We travel and we journey. And John is reminding us that as we travel through these stages, we go with God to stay right there in that place of illumination. And we live in a world that there is so much confusion, so much darkness, so many who are lost. And darkness can be really troubling. I think that if you've ever had to walk in darkness, I remember when I was working at Forest Home, my cabin was at the end of this road, and it was like the last light. There was still like 500 yards before I'd reach my cabin, and if I was walking home at night, it would be pitch black. And if I'm honest, I would start walking really fast, right? Like it just is really uncomfortable. I remember a time where Tom Berryman and I, we with Clark Broger, had climbed Talkeets, and there was a men's retreat that was happening. We thought, we'll go do this climb and then catch up with the guys that night in Idlewild. And it's a multi-pitch climb. There was 3 of us. We thought we were going to climb faster than we did. And we reached the top, and it's dark. And all of us are like these just well-prepared outdoorsmen. None of us brought a flashlight. And we have to descend off this peak in the dark. And it's tricky in the daylight to get down. We end up descending and just rappelling off the side without knowing like what was underneath us as we were going. I'm thinking, this is where things go really wrong, right? And there's part of you that's like, we should just stay here and wait to get rescued, but it's freezing. And so we just make this crazy descent, and so relieved to like get down to the bottom. But now we've got to go down this huge, like almost a mile of steep downhill in the pitch dark. And so many times I remember almost injuring myself. One time I like stepped in between 2 logs and felt that like leverage on my leg and was thinking, oh my gosh, with just a little bit more force and something terrible would have happened. This was long enough ago that Tom had this little Palm Trio, and he kept, like, the battery was dying, but kept flashing it every once in a while. And you get this flash of light that all of a sudden for a second would illuminate the world around you. This idea of light when we're in the darkness is this powerful thing that brings illumination. But I think that we've lived in a world that has sort of adjusted to the dark, that it assumes that this is all there is. I didn't finish the episode, but there's a show out on Apple TV called See. Has anybody watched this? Where everybody in it is blind. I started watching it and it stressed me out. But they've all adapted to live that way, but everybody blind. And I was thinking, what an interesting metaphor for the world that we live in. We're blind and yet don't realize it. And so all we end up doing is kind of getting through this life, stumbling our way around, trying not to bump into each other. But the question of where are we going, right? If you're in the dark, it becomes almost irrelevant. We just try to keep ourselves out of danger. And if this is all there is, if we sort of live in this dark space, then what we end up doing is clinging to the stuff that we find. There's a philosopher, Plato, who has this classic example of the cave. And Plato would say that the people in this world are like people that are sort of chained in this cave where all they see is the shadows on the walls in front of them. That from that, they're trying to understand what life is about, but eventually that is reality itself, is just the shadow. And he entertains this idea, what would it be like to be taken out of the cave and into the sunlight? But the truth is, that sort of light would probably be more than our eyes could handle. That we have a God who comes in humility and just shows us these glimmers of light, glimmers of revelation that tell us that there's more. And when light comes, it has this way of sort of convicting us. Sometimes we don't like the light. In John's gospel, he's going to say the light has entered into the darkness, but that the darkness hated the light. Meaning as the light came in, the darkness didn't like what it saw. And I think about this for myself, how truth is when it comes. That truth that sort of makes you squirm when somebody tells you you've got a booger in your nose, right? Truth comes in and you're like, we don't always like it. I remember I went to a surf camp a few years ago, and at this camp they filmed us, right? Which sounds great. And I got some really good photos, like I have one. Okay, so this is what I look like when I surf all the time, right? Except what the problem is, what the next photo is, do you got that, Mark? Yeah, you get these photos too, right? This is me just about to get thumped by this wave. My hands are all clutched, my eyes, I just know I'm just gonna get dumped on. There's a couple more photos. Oh, there's Tom. I didn't ask permission. There's Chuck. Don't you love that? Look how relaxed Chuck is. Just accepting his fate. But truth is like this. It comes in and it sort of, not only does it illuminate, but it exposes. It shows us the truth. It shows us where we're out of line. It sort of bursts our bubble. That we have this sort of value system in the dark where we can think better of ourselves. And this is the problem when the truth comes in, right? It shows us reality and not always the reality we would like to see. I've heard it said that reality is what you bump into when you're wrong. And I think we live in a world where we so often think that truth is kind of what we make it to be. But this is reminding us of something more, that no, not only is there a greater reality out here, but there's a sort of responsibility to it, that our actions and our decisions and how we live have consequences. Scripture tells us this over and over. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. That the word of the prophets is a light shining in a dark place. And that ultimately, in the end, John is showing us that Jesus himself is this light that comes in. The clearest picture of truth that we have is found in him. 2 Corinthians 4:6 says, let light shine out of darkness. And it says, he has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus. That God comes in and in his gentleness begins shining the truth in such a way that we can see. This revelation comes and it illuminates. It shows us that there's more. It shows us there's a destination. It shows us that there is value to this life greater than we understand. That in the end, our identity is wrapped up in that, as Bob was sharing that song where John is saying, the beloved disciple. When John writes, that's how he addresses himself. That when we understand this truth, we understand this life, we understand our identity. That love is not some scarce thing that we hoard, but something that is given so generously to all, that is the greater reality. Sometimes I think in the dark, we're like underneath the table, like scrambling for the scraps that had fallen off. And God is saying, but there's a feast before you, that your joy can be made complete. The light for John shows us truth, but it also shows us purity. And how that so often in the dark we get purity confused. In Isaiah 5:20, the prophet says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And so often this is what is happening around us, that we follow pleasure as if it's the ultimate good, or we seek our own sort of power or possession, popularity, as ways of measuring our worth, and we hoard those things, but we're also, if we're honest, threatened when somebody else gets that thing that we want. In this scarcity world, that pleasure is followed by jealousy and insecurity. We live in this place of deep insecurity. And light shines into the darkness, and we have to learn to, I think at first, welcome it in. In fact, I think we need to learn how to get an appreciation for the taste of truth. And at first, it just tastes like conviction, which if you're like me, that's sort of an unpleasant feeling. But conviction brings invitation. It brings opportunity. First, it sort of just feels like judgment, doesn't it? I've told this story before, but I remember I was flying back from Connecticut, and I had a flight that connected in Dallas, and some people were coming up from Cancun, and I was sitting next to these two people as they were sharing about their trip of debauchery that had just taken place for the two of them, laughing about all the things that they had done and all the wild things. One of them said, you know what happens in Cancun stays in Cancun. And then they turned to me and they're like, so what do you do? I'm like, shoot, right? Like, Well, I'm a pastor. You just see the look, right? They're like, oh gosh, like, how did I get this seat? Like, but I tell that story because, I mean, the truth is, like, you have this sort of awkward pause. And like, and I just smile, it's all right, But all of a sudden the conversation sort of shifts, right? Doesn't it? But what comes next so often is vulnerability. What comes next is their own story, their own path, their own journey that they're on. And see, this becomes the opportunity not to sit in some sort of self-righteousness with your arms crossed, like, look at my life compared to your life, because that's just to completely miss the point. But the truth is, the deeper longings are what are exposed as well. Yeah, the ways that we're out of alignment. Yeah, the ways that we're like, our priorities are out of whack, but also the greater hopes that life has meaning and purpose. That the pleasure that we're seeking after, there's got to be more. Because we know this, right? We attain these things even when we're happy, we're not happy. Which is why John is beckoning us to this sense of completed joy, something bigger. And it happens in our self-forgetfulness. It happens when we lose ourselves. John is going to tell us in 1 John 2 later, he's going to say, whoever loves his brother is in the light, lives in the light. The way that we are meant to live is in this place of deep love for others. But in order to get there, something in us has to change, doesn't it? Not just our values and our priorities, but our whole identity. Who am I? John is, just to kind of go back to our text, going to be addressing here this week and next week these sort of three false claims. And the first one that we're focusing on today talks about this, that if we claim that we're in the light but there's darkness in us, that we're out of sync. He's just going, this is just a sort of basic truth. That in order for us to function as Christians, we need to be plugged into that source. Jesus refers to this as abiding, like a vine in a branch. This is what brings us to life. I was having problems this week with my computer, the power adapter not working, right? And all of a sudden the little lightning bolt thing on that, like, is this charging or is it not? It's gone off, right? So you start troubleshooting this thing, but the battery level the whole time is sort of dwindling as I'm doing this. And getting this thing plugged into the source, it's getting my computer so it's functioning properly. In so many ways, Jesus is saying this is what happens when you sin, is you break this connection. And this isn't Jesus withholding, it's just what sin does. It's this independence in ourselves that cuts us off from the source. And we choose that, don't we? Like when we kind of take a break from being good. We allow ourselves the luxury of a temptation or a sin. There's a consequence there, but not as like a sort of vindictive punishment. It's just the natural result. When we step back in our independence, we cut ourselves off from the source. I was reading a book by Aldous Huxley this week, and he refers to this, what he calls this blasphemous idea of individual self-sufficiency, with their inevitable corollaries of greed, envy, lust for power, anger, and cruelty. And individual self-sufficiency, I thought that's a fantastic way of describing sin. You think all the way back to the garden, right? This decision, like if you eat this, you can be God. You can be self-sufficient. You can self-illuminate, right? That rather than depending on God for the light, you can be the source of the light. Which I'm just going to tell you, Scripture is going to say that never is going to happen. You will never be the source of the light. But when properly aligned, you will illuminate with a light not your own. In sin, this idea of pride becomes this thing that cuts us off. I like this from Mere Christianity. Lewis says, the vice I'm talking of is pride or self-conceit. And the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And to walk in the light means our pride is exposed. It just does. It shows it. It reveals it to us. When we choose to step over in our self-sufficiency, it comes with a cost. As we remain in the light, that pride withers and dies. That small self in us. And so often what we've done is we've walked again and again and again in darkness to where that becomes habitual for us. We walk in darkness. And John is saying, no, walk in the light, which has this continuous day by day walk in the light. Discipline yourself to live in the truth. Live in this place of openness and authenticity before God. That when we stay there, something happens to our hearts. That our hearts are what you might describe as being resensitized. John's going to say the blood of Christ washes away the stain. And I love this picture because this isn't like a one-time thing. I mean, it is, right? That something happens at once, that this blood of Christ just simply represents the price that it cost. That to set the world right, to pay that price for all the injustice, somebody had to pay for it. Christ is not only the light, but he's the blood, the sacrifice, the one who atoned, who set things right. But that work is doing an ongoing job in our heart. It is purifying us. John says, if we claim these things, right? And he's talking to us. He's talking to believers. And he says, we as believers must walk continually in the light. And as it does, it is washing away the stains. And what he's getting at is this sort of theological idea that we call sanctification. And sanctification is this sort of ongoing healing and cleansing of the hearts of Christians. And this is something that we will continue in for the rest of our life, that we don't arrive, we continue to stay in the light the whole way. But as this happens, something is changing. Our hearts are becoming more and more sensitive to the sin, deeper and deeper conviction of the things that we do wrong. I wrote a little blog the other day talking about being offended by this customer service representative, and it was so like demeaning and derogatory. And I was like, I left there just sort of fuming, right? That like boiling under the skin. All the thoughts I wanted to say back in my defense as I'm studying for a sermon about walking in the light. Right? And you see God going, what's this, Jeff? It's just ego, this thing in me. I respond like nobody talks to me that way, right? And you see Jesus going, just let that go. That fight for myself. And to know that I'm the beloved, to know that I have this love of God right there in that place of brokenness, that actually is much deeper than this petty little fight I'm in. But as long as I'm clenching my fist like that, I cannot receive it. That to release and surrender that, to let go of that small self, is to have my hands open, to embrace so much more. In John 8:12, Jesus says to them, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And this light, as we welcome it in, it changes our hearts. And what it does is it makes us more and more and more generous as we become less selfish, we become more selfless. And this is what we find, that to be brought to life as followers of God means getting over ourselves and being freed up to be able to pour the love or the light that we've received, the life that we've been given, into others. That as we walk in the light, not only is our stains of our hearts removed, but we're able to enter into fellowship. And remember this is what John is getting at, that like the joy and the life is found in the fellowship. It's found in the intimacy. It's found in the connection. It's giving us the space to see the needs of others and not just our own. When we walk in, we're not wrestling with our own insecurities, but freed up to notice others, but also notice the people that are at the fringes, the ones left out, the ones feeling like they don't belong. Jesus is saying, go to them. And yes, there's a sort of sense of obligation, right? If you're going to say I'm in the light, that means you're going to love others, right? But the fact is, this is the kind of people that we're becoming or should be. This is the journey. This is the trajectory. This is the transformation. I like how John says here, if you walk in the light, you will have fellowship with others. And it's almost like he's skipping a step, right? Because we would go, if we walk in the light, we have fellowship with God. And he's going, yes, that's true. Although he doesn't say that here. He jumps to the third. It's like A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. If you walk in the light, you will walk with God. If you walk with God, you will love others. When Jesus says, what's the greatest commandment? He says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And as we do, our hearts become cleansed. But we start entering into this life of deep meaning. That those in the darkness who are longing for a trajectory or a way, where are we going? Is there a purpose in all of this? This becomes the answer. The answer is yes. That we are designed for a life to be lived in fellowship with God and with others. That a way has been made, that truth has shown in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. 1 John 4, 9 through 10 says, in this love, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love. Not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation or the payment of the debt for our sins. And this is the beautiful hope that we can enter into. This is the invitation that Jesus makes again and again and again. It's like Paul was saying, that God is not getting better. It's that our eyes are becoming more and more open. To see the beauty, to grasp the depth, and then to trust in that. Because the truth is, for us walking in the light, it makes me think of that pillar of fire that the Jews followed in the desert, right? I mean, the light again and again shows up. It's a burning bush there, but as they're wandering through the desert, they're following this flame. And what I think is funny, you've seen these like little animations in movies where like you're going from point A to point B and you see this kind of dotted line appear on the screen. Do you know what I'm talking about? And if you could map out the Israelites in the wilderness following this flame, it's like, right? Like God is leading them all over the place. And so often I think in our lives as we walk in the light, we're going, okay, where are we going? Have you ever felt that way? God, where are you leading me? But the gift of this, God continues to say to us, trust me. As you're going through life and all of a sudden you're going, it feels dark, or I feel unsure, God's just saying, stay right here with me. I was meeting with somebody who's not part of this church, so I'm not telling on anybody here, but they were saying, I just wish God would tell me where we're going, because I think I could get there faster. You're like, no kidding, right? But you see God going, yeah, and that would miss the point, right? Because the destination, we're so intent on the destination. And God's whole focus is on the transformation. That as he leads us through this again and again, comes this opportunity that this self in me can be laid down again and again and again. And as I'm tempted to reattach to it, cling to that thing, John is going to remind us, no, walk in the light day after day. Like Annie Dillard says, how we live our days is how we live our lives. Walk each day in the light. And what happens is our hearts change and we start to shine. One of my favorite passages, I read this a number of times, but I'm going to read it again because I just think it's so good. But in Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about what he describes as the new men, or the new men and women. And he's saying you have to be trained to see them because you see they start to diminish in a way, to kind of fall back into the background. But if you're trained, you can start to spot them. And he says their very voices and faces are different from ours. Stronger, quieter, happier, more radiant. They begin where most of us leave off. They are, I say, recognizable, but you must know what to look for. For they will not be very like the idea of religious people, which you have formed from your general reading. They do not draw attention to themselves. You tend to think that you are being kind to them when they are being really kind to you. They love you more than other men do, but they need you less. They will usually seem to have a lot of time. You will wonder where it comes from. When you've recognized one of them, you will recognize the next one much more easily. And I strongly suspect, but how should I know, that they recognize one another immediately and infallibly across every barrier of color, sex, class, age, and even of creeds. And that way to become holy is rather like joining a secret society. To put it at the very lowest, it must be great fun. A sweet way of putting it. But this is the invitation to live this life, this beautiful life, instead of shining our sort of pathetic, selfish light, a way for God's light to shine through, to show us beauty. I have some questions for you for consideration. Number one, are there areas of your life that you choose to keep hidden from God? What is that you are choosing in these moments? And what does it cost you? That's just an honest question for reflection. What are those things? Notice those things. What are those things that I sort of keep in that cupboard? Because the idea, if we're honest, is a silly idea that we could hide anything in our hearts from God. But by hiding it, what does it cost? 2, how is your intimacy with God today? How is your trust? Are there areas you find it especially difficult to trust God with? Could you be really honest with God about those things? I think this is part of the journey as we walk into the light, is learning to trust God with more and more and more of ourselves. These are questions not to invoke shame. These are questions to invite us to more. And lastly, who do you find yourself withholding love from? What are the emotions behind that choice? What would it be like to ask God for his love for that person? I was thinking about this yesterday doing the wedding for Reuben and Darby. And that marriage, this selfless pouring out, this is what it takes, right? But we don't stand here with our own limited reserves of love to offer. That a life that is lived in that light is being filled and filled and filled. It's from that wellspring of life that we're able to love others. That is the source that we tap into. And so Jesus says in Matthew 5:14-16, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, church by the sea, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Amen. Would you stand with me? And for anyone that would like prayer, we'll be down front to pray. We're so excited that we can just gather and enjoy a meal and hang out in the courtyard. I think there might even be a lady, like what do you call that? Balloon animals, right? So have at it. But let me leave you with a blessing as we go, that God would bless you and keep you. May God make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. And may he lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. God bless you. Thanks, my friends.